March 6th, 1943, Jebel el Hamra, Tunisia. The wind howling across the dorsal mountains carries the scent of spent cordite and frozen eucalyptus. In the valley below, the charred skeletons of M3 Stuart tanks sit as silent monuments to the disaster at Kasserine Pass, a place where American pride went to die in the mud just weeks prior. The U.S. Second Corps is a broken instrument, its soldiers shivering in foxholes, haunted by the terrifying efficiency of the German 88s. Suddenly, a dust cloud erupts on the horizon. A command car, flanked by motorcycles, tears through the encampment. It does not slow for the checkpoints. Out of the vehicle steps a man who looks more like a conqueror than a general. 2 ivory-handled revolvers are holstered at his hips. His helmet is polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the harsh North African sun. George S. Patton Jr. surveys the wreckage of his new command with eyes of cold steel. Miles away, in a mobile command trailer shielded by camouflage netting, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel pores over reconnaissance reports. He notes a sudden, violent change in American radio discipline and aggressive positioning. He recognizes the signature of a predator. Rommel looks to his staff, his voice raspy from the desert dust, and issues a warning that will go unheeded by the high command in Berlin. The amateurs have found their master, and the desert is about to burn. The era of the Green American Army is over. The era of the Bandit has begun. To understand why Rommel felt compelled to warn his peers about a man most German generals had never heard of, we must look back to the chaotic winter of 1942. When Operation Torch commenced in November, the United States Army was, for all intents and purposes, a 19th century institution, attempting to fight a 20th century war. The American soldiers arriving on the shores of Morocco and Algeria were products of a rapid, almost frantic mobilization. Many had never seen combat. Some had never even fired their weapons under simulated stress. They were led by officers who relied on outdated manuals and a belief that American industrial might would inherently compensate for a lack of tactical finesse. This optimism was shattered the moment they encountered the veterans of the Deutsches Afrika Korps. By February 1943, the Allied advance toward Tunis had stalled. The geography of Tunisia, a jagged landscape of mountain passes and salt flats, favored the defender. Rommel, despite being plagued by dwindling supplies and failing health, saw a golden opportunity to deliver a knockout blow to the soft Americans before the British 8th Army under Montgomery could close the trap from the east. The result was the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was not merely a defeat for the United States, it was a humiliation. German Tiger tanks and experienced Panzer Grenadiers tore through the American lines. U.S. units dissolved in panic. Equipment was abandoned in such quantities that the Germans began referring to the American trucks and half-tracks as their primary source of resupply. In the aftermath, the U.S. Second Corps was a laughingstock among the German general staff. To the aristocrats in Berlin, the Americans were cowboys who lacked the stomach for the battle of annihilation. But Rommel, ever the student of the individual, saw something in the chaos that his superiors missed. He saw how quickly the Americans learned from their mistakes. He noticed that while they broke easily, they regrouped with a resilience that the more rigid European armies lacked. He realized that the only thing holding the American giant back was a lack of ruthless leadership. When news reached Rommel's headquarters that Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall had been sacked and replaced by George Patton, the Desert Fox began to study his new opponent. He saw a man who shared his own philosophy of speed, violence of action, and the cult of the personality. Rommel understood that a general who wore ivory-handled revolvers was not interested in a war of attrition. He was interested in a war of ego and movement. As Patton took the reins of the Second Corps on March 6th, he inherited a force that was physically present, but psychologically defeated. His first acts were not strategic, but cosmetic and disciplinary. He fined soldiers for not wearing leggings. He forced officers to wear ties in the desert heat. He demanded that every vehicle be polished. To the tired GIs, it seemed like madness. To Patton, it was the first step in rebuilding the soul of an army. And to Rommel, watching from across the salt flats, it was the lighting of a fuse. While Patton was instilling a draconian sense of discipline in the Second Corps, the broader strategic landscape of North Africa was shifting like the treacherous sands of the Grand Erg Oriental. By mid-March 1943, the Axis powers were caught in a tightening vice. To the east, Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army was hammering at the Mareth Line. To the west, the revitalized Americans were beginning to stir. Rommel's strategic concern was no longer just winning battles. It was the survival of his army. He knew that the Mediterranean was becoming an allied lake. Supply ships from Italy were being sent to the bottom of the sea by British subs and American planes at an alarming rate. For every gallon of fuel that reached the Africa Corps, 3 were lost to the waves. This logistical strangulation meant that the German forces had to be decisive. They could not afford a prolonged defensive struggle against an enemy with infinite industrial depth. Inside the German High Command, however, a dangerous delusion had taken root. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim and the High Command in Berlin viewed the American performance at Kasserine as definitive proof of racial and tactical inferiority. They believed the American soldier was a creature of comfort, incapable of enduring the hardships of the desert or the ferocity of a panzer assault. To them, the Americans were a B team that could be ignored while they focused on the real threat of the British. Rommel disagreed vehemently. He had spent his career studying the man on the other side of the hill. He began to see reports of Patton's arrival and the subsequent Pattonizing of the Second Corps. Intelligence indicated that the Americans were no longer retreating at the first sight of a Mark I tank. Instead, they were digging in, utilizing their superior artillery coordination, a branch of the U.S. military that Rommel noted was already world-class. The field marshal saw that Patton was doing something revolutionary. He was marrying American industrial capacity to a Prussian sense of aggression. Patton wasn't just fixing the Second Corps. He was turning it into a reflection of himself. He moved his headquarters as close to the front as possible, often flying his own reconnaissance missions in a light Sentinel aircraft. This was exactly how Rommel had operated during the height of his success in 1941. Rommel issued a series of warnings to von Arnim and Kesselring. He argued that the Americans would not stay behind their defenses for long. He warned that the new American commander was a romantic of the old school who understood that in the desert, speed was armor. But Rommel was a man whose star was fading in Hitler's eyes. His warnings were dismissed as the pessimism of a sick man. The German leadership remained convinced that the Americans were merely amateurs playing at war, a mistake that would lead them directly into the jaws of the coming storm. Rommel's respect for Patton was born of a shared tactical DNA. Both men despised the committee style of leadership. They believed in the fingertip feeling for the battlefield. When Rommel observed the Americans' sudden shift toward night attacks and aggressive patrolling, he didn't see lucky amateurs. He saw a commander who understood that the psychological initiative was more valuable than high ground. Rommel wrote in his journals about the extraordinary sense of the operational the Americans were beginning to show. He recognized that while the British were methodical and slow, the Americans under Patton were becoming unpredictable and fast, the very traits that had made Rommel the Desert Fox. On the American side, Patton's angle was purely psychological. He knew his men were terrified of the Germans. To counter this, he created a persona that was more terrifying than the enemy. The Blood and Guts moniker wasn't just for the press. It was a tool to shock the Second Corps out of its lethargy. He enforced the wearing of neckties and helmets, even in the rear, because he knew that if a man didn't have the discipline to shave, he wouldn't have the discipline to hold his ground against a Tiger tank. This theatrical leadership was often mocked by his peers, but it was the exact catalyst needed to transmute a mob of civilians into a cohesive military machine. By 1943, the technological landscape was shifting. The Germans still held the qualitative edge with the Tiger I and the long-barreled Panzer IV Specials, but the Americans were introducing the M4 Sherman in significant numbers. Rommel warned that the Americans didn't need a better tank. They just needed enough tanks and the aggression to use them. He saw that the American self-propelled howitzers allowed for a level of mobile fire support the Germans could no longer match. The German perspective was one of declining quality versus overwhelming quantity. A reality the High Command refused to acknowledge until the steel started raining down on their positions. The German officer corps, largely composed of Prussian aristocrats who had spent their entire lives studying the art of war, viewed the American military through a lens of profound cultural snobbery. To General von Arnim, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, George Patton was nothing more than a wealthy polo player who had bought his way into a command. This perspective was a structural weakness. Because the Germans believed the Americans were fundamentally incapable of mastering complex combined arms maneuvers, they failed to prepare for the American evolution. They ignored Rommel's frantic warnings because to believe Rommel was to admit that a nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians could best the Wehrmacht. This arrogance led them to leave their flanks exposed to Patton's rapidly improving motorized infantry. There was also the moral and psychological front. The German soldier in early 1943 was beginning to feel the first tremors of doubt. The disaster at Stalingrad had echoed across the Mediterranean, and the sense of being trapped in Africa was growing. Patton understood this instinctively. He didn't just want to defeat the Germans. He wanted to humiliate them. He ordered his troops to never take a step back and to make the Germans fear the American bayonet. By contrast, Rommel's moral burden was the health of his men. He was increasingly disillusioned with Hitler's stand-or-die orders, which he saw as a waste of veteran lives. This created a psychological disparity. Patton was a man on the rise, fueled by a destiny he believed was divinely ordained, while Rommel was a man in decline, fighting a war he knew was already lost. Finally, we must consider the diverging styles of command. Patton's leadership was characterized by presence. He was constantly on the move, his siren-blaring command car becoming a symbol of American renewed vigor. He led from the front, often personally directing traffic at congested crossroads to keep the momentum of an attack alive. Meanwhile, the German command structure was becoming increasingly fractured. Rommel was being sidelined by Kasserine and von Arnim, who were more interested in political maneuvering than tactical reality. While Patton was unifying the Second Corps into a singular, aggressive fist, The German defense was being split between competing commanders who refused to coordinate. By late March, these factors converged. Rommel's warnings were no longer theoretical. They were about to be validated in the hills of El Guettar. March 23rd, 1943. 06 arc hours. The El Guettar Valley. The morning mist clings to the jagged limestone ridges of the Atlas Mountains as the first light of dawn touched the valley floor. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, the silence is deafening. They are dug into the heights overlooking the road to Gabes, waiting for the test they know is coming. Patton had anticipated the German move. He knew that the 10th Panzer Division, one of the most decorated units in the German army, would try to blunt the American advance toward the coast. He had spent the previous 48 hours personally inspecting the gun pits of his artillery. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a massacre. He told his commanders, "If we are not victorious, let no one come back alive." Suddenly, the horizon vibrates. The low, rhythmic thrum of Maybach engines begins to shake the desert floor. Over 50 German tanks, including the fearsome Panzer Phase and several early-model Tigers, emerge from the dust. They move in a classic wedge formation, supported by half-tracks filled with Panzer Grenadiers. To any other unit, this sight would have triggered a retreat. But Patton's discipline had taken root. The Germans, confident in their superiority, drove straight into the mouth of the American trap. They expected the Americans to fire too early and then flee. Instead, the Americans waited. At 2,000 yards, the German tanks began to fire their long 75mm guns, the shells whistling over the American foxholes. Still, Patton's men held. It wasn't until the lead panzers reached the 1,000-yard mark that the valley exploded. American tank destroyers opened up from concealed positions on the ridges. But the real angel of death was the American artillery. Patton had massed every available 105 and 155mm howitzer into a single coordinated fire direction center. For the first time in the war, the Germans experienced time-on-target fire, where shells from multiple batteries, fired at different intervals, all land on the same spot at the exact same second. The 10th Panzer Division was caught in a literal rain of steel. Tanks were not just disabled, they were obliterated. The German infantry, caught in the open, were shredded by air-bursting shells. Through his binoculars, Patton watched the carnage with a grim satisfaction. He turned to his aide and famously remarked, "Compared to war, all other forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance." The Germans, stunned by the ferocity and accuracy of the American response, did something they rarely did. They stalled. They regrouped, tried to flank the positions, and were met again by a wall of fire. The amateurs were holding their ground against the elite of the Wehrmacht. The 10th Panzer Division was not easily discouraged. Their commander, General von Broich, ordered a second, more desperate assault at 16 o'clock hours. This was the moment Rommel had feared. The Germans were throwing their remaining mobile reserves into a frontal assault against an enemy that had found its backbone. The German tanks charged again, this time supported by Stuka dive bombers. The screech of the sirens filled the valley. But the American anti-aircraft batteries, now fully integrated into Patton's defense, filled the sky with flak. The Stukas were forced to release their payloads early, missing their marks. On the ground, the German panzers managed to penetrate the initial infantry lines, reaching within 500 yards of the American artillery positions. This was the breaking point. In the previous month at Kasserine, this would have been the moment the Americans abandoned their guns and fled. Instead, the American artillerymen shortened their fuses for direct fire. They began firing over open sights, slamming shells directly into the faces of the German tanks. Patton was everywhere. He moved between the batteries, his presence a physical anchor for the men. He didn't just command, he performed. The sight of the general standing upright while German shells bracketed the ridge became legendary. Under his gaze, the 1st Infantry Division held. By sunset, the valley of El Guettar was a graveyard of German ambition. Nearly 30 German tanks sat burning in the twilight, their crews retreating on foot. It was the first time in the war that a U.S. division had defeated a German panzer division in a major engagement. The myth of the invincible Afrika Korps had been shattered, and more importantly, the myth of the incompetent American soldier had been buried alongside it. Back at the German headquarters, the mood was funereal. Rommel, who was by now preparing for his final departure from Africa due to his failing health, received the reports with a bitter told-you-so resignation. He had warned that Patton would not fight like a textbook general, but like a predator who understood that momentum was everything. Von Arnim and the High Command were silent. They had no more excuses. They had sent their best against Patton's amateurs, and their best had been broken. The battle wasn't just a tactical win. It was a psychological decapitation. The Germans realized they were no longer fighting the Green Boys of November. They were fighting a professional army led by a man who was perhaps more German in his military philosophy than they were. Rommel's warning had been a prophecy, and the fulfillment of that prophecy meant the end of the Axis presence in Africa was now a matter of when, not if. As the smoke cleared, Patton wrote in his diary with uncharacteristic brevity, "We met the tiger, and we looked him in the eye. He blinked." The American 2nd Corps began to move forward, no longer a collection of units, but a singular, vengeful machine, transitioning seamlessly from defense to a relentless, grinding pursuit. The immediate aftermath of El Guettar and the subsequent American push through the mountain passes was a logistical and human catastrophe for the Axis. By May 1943, the Tunisian bridgehead had collapsed. Over 230,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, a number larger than the loss at Stalingrad. For the German army, North Africa was no longer a theater of glory. It was a prison. The casualty figures told a grim story. While the Americans had suffered heavily during the initial months of the campaign, the final weeks saw a reversal. The Germans were losing their most experienced officers, men who could not be replaced. Patton's blood and guts philosophy had translated into a cold, mathematical reality. He was willing to spend American shells to save American lives, while the Germans were forced to spend lives because they had no shells. In the prisoner of war camps, German officers finally met the men they had dismissed as soft. They found soldiers who were better fed, better equipped, and possessed of a frighteningly high level of mechanical skill. A common German report from the time noted with shock that nearly every American private can drive a truck and repair a radio. This was the industrial age army Rommel had warned about, one where every individual was a technician of war. The psychological impact on the German leadership was profound. Rommel, back in Germany and recovering from his illnesses, was haunted by the defeat. He privately told his wife that the entry of the Americans into the war was the end of the beginning for Germany. He had seen the future of warfare in Patton's eyes, and it was a future Germany could not win. Meanwhile, in the Allied camp, the Patton legend was officially born. Before Africa, he was a colorful eccentric. After Africa, he was a national hero. General Dwight D. Eisenhower realized he had found his fighting general. The Second Corps, once the laughingstock of the Mediterranean, was now the elite strike force of the U.S. Army. They had been forged in the desert heat, and the cooling process had left them hard as the steel of their own tanks. The strategic ripples of the African collapse traveled far beyond the salt flats of Tunisia. For the German High Command, the Patton warning finally became a centerpiece of their defensive doctrine, though far too late to save the Afrika Korps. The High Command was forced to acknowledge that the Western Front was no longer a secondary theater. The amateurs had proven they could execute complex, large-scale amphibious and armored operations. This shift in perception led to a frantic reorganization of the Atlantic Wall. German planners, now terrified of Patton's speed, began to obsess over his whereabouts. The Patton effect became a weapon of war in itself. For the remainder of the conflict, the mere rumor of Patton's presence in a sector was enough to cause German commanders to freeze their reserves in place. Rommel, eventually tasked with defending in northern France, would later design his defenses specifically to counter the high mobility tactics he had first seen Patton employ in the desert. In terms of military doctrine, North Africa served as the great classroom for the United States. The failures and successes led to a total overhaul of U.S. Army field manuals. The air-ground cooperation that would become the hallmark of the Normandy campaign was perfected in the skies over Tunisia. The Americans learned that their tanks were not solo hunters, but part of a combined arms team that included devastatingly precise artillery and air support. The diplomatic consequences were equally severe. The Italian leadership, seeing their African empire vanish and their best divisions captured, began the secret negotiations that would eventually lead to their exit from the war. Mussolini's prestige was shattered, and Hitler was forced to divert precious divisions from the Eastern Front to bolster the soft underbelly of Europe, a move that arguably saved the Soviet Union from further German breakthroughs in 1943. The most lasting impact, however, was the change in the American psyche. The U.S. Army left Africa with a victor's swagger. They had faced the most feared tactical minds of the age, and won. They had seen Rommel's shadow and refused to flinch. As the troop ships began to load for the invasion of Sicily, the soldiers didn't talk about surviving. They talked about winning. They were no longer a green force of civilians in uniform. They were the bandits Patton had promised they would become. History often remembers the Second World War as a clash of industrial titans, but at its heart it was a clash of individuals. The story of Rommel's warning and Patton's rise is a testament to the power of leadership to alter the course of nations. Erwin Rommel recognized in George Patton something his own superiors were too arrogant to see. That war is a living, evolving thing. The German High Command failed because they looked at the American soldier and saw only a snapshot of a moment in time, the chaos of Kasserine. Rommel looked at Patton and saw a trajectory. He understood that a nation with the will to learn and the resources to adapt is an unstoppable force. Patton, for all his flaws and theatrics, understood the fundamental truth of the 20th century. That modern war is decided by the speed of the mind as much as the speed of the tank. He took a broken, humiliated force, and through sheer force of will, turned it into a mirror of his own aggression. Today, the names Rommel and Patton are inextricably linked. Two masters of the desert who respected one another more than they respected their own bureaucracies. Their duel in the dust of Tunisia reminds us that in the crucible of conflict, the most dangerous weapon is not the tiger tank or the time-on-target artillery. It is the commander who refuses to believe his enemy is inferior. The desert has long since reclaimed the foxholes of El Guettar, and the rusted hulls of the panzers have vanished into the dunes. But the lesson remains. Never mistake a slow start for a weak finish. In the 3 weeks it took for Patton to change the world, he didn't just win a battle. He proved that a democracy, when pushed, can produce warriors as fierce as any autocracy's elite.